Okay, so we are on week 3 of the ChefGirl Nutrition Live cooking series. This week we are making, as you can see in my fancy sign here, we're making crispy baked eggplant with tomato basil salad. So this recipe, as with this whole cooking series, I'm always highlighting a couple of foods that are in season right now. Because we love seasonal foods because they are more nutritious and more delicious. So this week we are highlighting eggplant and tomatoes. So eggplant are kind of like just coming into season. They're really great like in the middle of the summer. Tomatoes are super delicious right now. So I also just kind of go by like what I see at my local farmers market because that's typically, you know, what's in season is whatever's growing locally at these farms. So I've been seeing all different kinds of varieties of eggplant and tomatoes. And so I chose this recipe also in honor of Father's Day because my dad and I both love eggplant, and he always used to cook eggplant parmesan when I was a kid. That was like his signature dish. So I kind of am taking all the flavors of eggplant parm, but we're making a lighter, more fresh dish for summer. So where instead of like a heavy tomato sauce and all the melted cheese, which though delicious is kind of heavy and maybe something we think of more for like a, you know, a comfort like cold weather meal, here we're gonna just be using tomatoes as they are because when they're in season they're super juicy and delicious as is. They don't really even, you know, need much manipulation at all. So I'm using these dark brown, they're like brown red cherry tomatoes. I love these. They're just like super, super sweet. So you can use whatever variety of cherry tomato you like. You could also just use regular, regular like beefsteak or Roma tomatoes or anything that you just chop up into pieces. So whatever you have or whatever you like will work just fine. And then instead of frying the eggplant in a lot of oil or butter, we're going to get it nice and breaded with panko breadcrumbs. And then we're going to bake it in the oven so it's a little bit lighter, but it'll still be super crispy. So we want to slice the eggplant and then salt it and let it sit just with the salt on it. So what that does is the salt will actually draw out some of the moisture that's in the eggplant, and that will help the eggplant get really super crispy. So that's one thing. And the other thing that it does is take away some of the bitter flavor that eggplant might have. So you can do this anytime you're going to be cooking eggplant. You can, you know, do this even if you're dicing it up, dice it up and then sprinkle salt over it and let it sit in like a colander or a strainer so that some of the liquid will come out. So what I did here, and you can let it sit for like up to 30 minutes. So I already sliced this up, sprinkled salt on both sides. I have it sitting on a wire rack here on a baking sheet, and I just put a clean dish towel underneath. And I know you probably can't see it in the video, but you can actually see droplets of water on the eggplant. So it really does draw out a lot of the moisture. So what I'll do now is I'm just gonna pat them dry. And so you can see here, this is how, in this recipe, this is how I recommend slicing the eggplant. So it's actually sliced lengthwise versus horizontally, but you could honestly do it either way. It'll, you know, the recipe will, you know, stay the same no matter which way you do it. So I actually have another eggplant, and I'll just show you. I wanted to make sure I could show you how I cut it up. So this is an Italian eggplant. You'll find a lot of different varieties of eggplant, especially at a farmer's market. You'll see like tiny eggplants, little fairy tale eggplants, I'm pretty sure they're called. Okay, so I just cut off that top piece there. If the other end is like a little yucky, you can cut it off. And also with the eggplant, the skin on eggplant sometimes can be a little bit tough. Some people don't like it. So you could definitely peel the eggplant before slicing it up if you know you don't like the skin. But the skin does contain a lot of the nutrients in the eggplant. So if you don't mind the texture of it, you can definitely leave it on and you'll get a lot of extra nutrients out of that. So we just cut it down lengthwise from the top. And then just hold it. It's a little more difficult because it's not so stable, but you just hold it. You want to be using a sharp knife so that it'll go through the skin. And just slice down like that, and you get a lengthwise slice versus cutting it. I'm gonna put it back together. If it's like this, and we can cut it horizontally and get more like circular discs out of it, that's fine too. So whichever way floats your boat. Okay, so I'm gonna set this aside because we don't need the other eggplant right now. And we'll bring our tray back here. So our next step, actually our first step, which I forgot to mention, is to preheat your oven because the eggplant needs to be baked. So we're preheating the oven to 425. So generally somewhere in like the 400, 425 range is what I recommend for any sort of roasting of veggies. Okay, so now we have our eggplants here. So we're going to make our breading mixture. So you want a couple of shallow dishes. So for this, I just use Tupperware containers. It's just the easiest thing, but if you have any other like shallow bowl or anything, you can use that. Just something that you'll be able to, fit the eggplant in so that it can get well coated. So in one container, we have 1 large egg. And to that, I'm going to add a splash of cold water. You don't need to do it, but it just helps to emulsify the egg better. So I'm just going to do that. Okay. So I have the egg, and we're just going to whisk that guy up. And I want to mention too that you can definitely, could definitely do this same recipe with chicken, with chicken breasts, and do a breaded chicken. I would, for something like this, I'd recommend pounding out chicken breasts if you are going to use them to make them thinner. And then bake them, same way for 15 to 20 minutes or so. But the egg, this dish itself just makes it's another good plant-based dish. So eggplant kind of makes a really good like meat substitute, kind of like portobello mushrooms, eggplant, where they're like kind of, they have like a meatier kind of texture to them. So this is a really great just plant-based dish on its own. Okay, so we have the egg there, and then our other container or dish, we are using panko breadcrumbs. So these are Japanese breadcrumbs. They're a little bit more coarse than regular breadcrumbs. You could use regular breadcrumbs too, but this will just make them a little bit crispier, a little bit crunchier. So we want a 1/2 cup of the panko. Okay, 1/2 cup of the panko, 1/4 cup of grated Parmesan cheese. So again, really just trying to get like those eggplant parm kind of flavors in there. So I love to add Parmesan cheese in my breadcrumb mixture whenever I'm, baking chicken breasts, or even when I'm making meatballs or burgers or something. I always put Parmesan cheese in that, in the mixture with the meat. And we want a pinch of salt. Just a little pinch. A few grinds of freshly ground black pepper, or just a pinch of black pepper. And a 1/2 teaspoon of garlic powder. then you want to really season plain breadcrumbs whenever you're using them. I'm just going to mix this all together here. Because the regular plain breadcrumbs don't really have any flavor on their own. So by adding different spices and the Parmesan cheese into that, you get a lot of flavor in the breadcrumbs themselves, so that the eggplant is super flavorful. Eggplant also is kind of like it actually is like very spongy. So it just kind of like absorbs flavors. So you want the stuff that you're serving with the eggplant or on the eggplant, you want all of that to be really flavorful. And then the eggplant will kind of pick up on those flavors. So now what we want to do, I'm going to take my towel off here. And then I'm going to line the baking sheet with parchment paper. God, I never ripped this. So, and we're actually going to bake the eggplant on the wire rack. So, two things here that we're doing to get the eggplant crispier. We let it sit with salt on it to draw out some of that moisture, and then we're going to cook it on the wire rack. So what this does is it keeps the eggplant elevated off of the tray so the air can circulate all the way around it, and that helps to make it really crispy so you don't get soggy breadcrumbs from it sitting in the moisture that comes out. So if you don't have a wire rack, it's okay. You can just bake it directly on the sheet. It just might get a little bit soggy on the bottom. So definitely, if you have a wire rack, this is a great use for it. So I just lined the sheet with parchment paper, kind of just to keep the tray cleaner. Honestly, you don't need to line the baking sheet. Okay. So we're going to do egg. We're going to dip each piece of eggplant in the egg mixture, and then in the panko mixture, and then back onto the wire rack. Okay, so I will put this down so you can see what I'm doing here. Okay, and I like to keep a fork in each of these just to make life a little bit easier. Try to you always want to try to keep one hand that deals with the wet and one hand that deals with the dry stuff, so you don't end up with breadcrumbs stuck to your fingers. Okay, so right into our egg mixture. Get both sides. Let it kind of drip off a little. You don't want, too much egg. Just enough to make the breadcrumbs stick. And then drop them right in. Then I use my other fork. Right, keep the one hand that's wet. Then flip. And then I use the dry fork to get the breadcrumbs on there. And you want to just kind of push it down so that they really stick. Okay. Right, and that's it. And then right back on the tray. So we'll just repeat that with all of the eggplant. Okay. I was saying about eggplant. So it's actually one of the least purchased produce in the country. And I think people just don't really know what to do with eggplant because it's not really like, an American vegetable. Like we don't really see it in typical American meals. Obviously we see it a lot in Italian meals, and I'm using an Italian eggplant here. But eggplant has a lot of really great health benefits. It is that dark, deep purple color, right? It is purple, even though it almost looks black. It's that deep, dark purple color means that there's all of these antioxidants in there. So the deeper, darker the color, the more good nutrients that are in there. So same thing with tomatoes too, that we're using. That bright red color means more and more antioxidants. Eggplant also eggplant also is high in fiber. The skin especially, which is why I'm saying if you do like the skin, keep the skin on. You get a lot of fiber that way. And eggplant is very good for heart health and for brain health. Probably the only thing that you probably hear the most about eggplant is that it's a nightshade vegetable and that we need to stay away from it if you have any sort of inflammatory issues. So it is a nightshade, along with other things in the nightshade family are potatoes, tomatoes, bell peppers. But really what's been shown with these nightshades is not that they, really it's that they can, like talking, you can't see me. Really it's that they can exacerbate inflammation when it already exists. So if you have an inflammatory issue like rheumatoid arthritis, you know, some sort of like autoimmune inflammatory disease, then these nightshades could exacerbate inflammation, but they're not really shown to cause inflammation if it's not already there, if that makes sense. So it's not like, oh, I should just stay away from any nightshades. You definitely don't have to. If it might, and even if you have something like rheumatoid arthritis, it's not like a definite, no. It's kind of one of those things where you just have to pay attention for yourself and kind of see if, you notice that it makes symptoms worse or not. Okay. A little bit of a nightshade tangent there. All right, so these are ready to go in the oven. I'm just going to give it a little spritz of olive oil spray over the top. You could also drizzle olive oil over the top, but this is just easier. And this will just help to crisp it up. So this is going to go in the oven, 425. We're going to put it in for 15 minutes, take them out, flip them, and then they'll go back in for another 10 minutes. Okay. So the next thing that we are doing is making the tomato basil salad. We're going to make just a very light dressing with balsamic vinegar and olive oil, and I'm using a shallot in this. You could also use a red onion, you could put garlic in. I just like a shallot in here. We want just a tablespoon of shallot minced up, so that's usually about like a half a shallot or so. I'll show you how I'm cutting this guy up. So we want it nice and minced because we don't really want, to bite on a big chunk of shallot. And so I work with shallots the same way that I work with an onion. Cut off each end, but we want to leave the root kind of intact, so just cut the very end of it off, and then cut it in half lengthwise. So now we have these two halves, and that makes it really easy to peel the skin off. Okay. All right. And like I said, I'm only going to use half of it. So then, very carefully, I just slice it in half. And then cut down lengthwise, just as I would dice up an onion. And then cut back across horizontally. And you get nice tiny pieces. just run your knife through just like you would be mincing garlic. I have another recipe too for an eggplant caponata that also uses eggplant and tomatoes. And that way you're cooking the eggplant by sauteing it. So definitely experimenting with different kinds of cooking methods can also, enhance, how you prefer something. Like you might not like eggplant roasted, but you might like it sauteed. It changes the whole texture and flavor of foods the way that you cook them. So you can always experiment with different cooking methods to kind of find a way that you enjoy something. Okay, so a tablespoon, I think I have more than a tablespoon here of the shallot. Yeah. Okay, so just add a tablespoon of shallot into a mixing bowl. So we have our shallot in here. We're going to add 2 tablespoons of olive oil. And why I like to add the shallot first and then add the olive oil and the balsamic vinegar here before we add the tomatoes in, because letting the shallot sit in the olive oil and balsamic vinegar for a little bit will help to mellow that oniony flavor, so it's not like, it's almost like if you were like gonna quick pickle something so that it's not just raw. It really helps mellow out that flavor of it a little bit. So we'll add 2 tablespoons of olive oil. And 1 tablespoon of balsamic vinegar. You could definitely do red wine vinegar is what I was saying if you prefer that flavor. And then we are going to add a pinch of salt. Okay, when I say a pinch, it's like a 1/4 teaspoon-ish. All right, it's just like a little pinchful. This is one of those things that you can taste it, and if you want it more salty, and a few cracks of freshly ground black pepper. Okay, and we'll give that a little stir, so it's just all here in this bowl. Okay. And so we'll just set this aside for a moment. Like I said, we'll let it sit. It'll help mellow out the flavor of that shallot. And then we can cut our tomatoes in half. Okay, so like I said, I'm using these dark red, brownish kind of cherry tomatoes that I just find to be super juicy. So I'm just using a paring knife to cut these in half. You can use any knife, but you want it to be sharp. Whenever you're cutting tomatoes, you want the knife to be sharp, just like the eggplant. Any kind of produce that has this sort of like thick skin on the outside, you want to be using a sharp knife, because if it's not sharp enough, 1, you can hurt yourself, and 2, it just like, especially with the tomato, the juice will, you'll like squeeze the juice out before you're able to cut the tomato open. So look at these. They're so yummy. Okay, so we're just cutting these in half. We want a cup of these halves. So it should be about like a half of a pint. Usually you buy cherry tomatoes by the pint, so it should be about a half of that. So tomatoes too come in so many different varieties that you can find a lot of different varieties in the grocery store usually too. But you'll see a ton of, different unusual ones at a farmer's market. And I definitely encourage you to try different varieties, try different colors. You'll learn that they all have a little bit of a different flavor. Some are sweeter, some are more sour. So actually, this is a fun fact about tomatoes and eggplant. Tomatoes and eggplant both are nightshade vegetables, which we just talked about a little bit. They also, and I just said they're vegetables, that is wrong. They are actually both botanically a fruit. So science speaking, they are a fruit. But we tend to work with them, we cook with them, we eat them as vegetables. But they are both technically fruits. So red tomatoes have something called lycopene in them, which you've probably heard. So lycopene is an antioxidant that is in tomatoes, and it's super heart protective. So tomatoes are really good for your heart health. They also have a lot of potassium, which is also good for your heart health. And also, to help better absorb that lycopene, adding fat to the tomatoes helps you to better absorb that lycopene to get the benefits of the antioxidants. So doing something like having the tomatoes in an olive oil based dressing where you're getting fat from the olive oil will help you to absorb that lycopene better. Even roasting, I love roasting cherry tomatoes, so you roast them in some olive oil. Usually we're having them, unless you're eating them raw, you're usually having them in some sort of dressing or something. So an olive oil based vinaigrette or dressing, or to cook them in olive oil, is really beneficial for getting all of the good nutrients out of the tomatoes. So we're going to be adding fresh basil into the tomato salad, but like I've mentioned before, with fresh herbs, especially something as delicate as basil, we don't want to cut it up ahead of time because it'll get all bruised and wilty looking. We want to chop it up at the very last minute and just toss it in there. So I have the basil all washed and ready to go, but we'll wait to chop it up until we're just about ready for it. All right, so 15 minutes is up on the eggplant. We're just going to take it out and flip it. Okay. Here you can see it's already getting nice and brown and crispy on the top. I'm just going to flip them over. And then I'm just going to give it one more spritz of the olive oil so the other side gets nice and crispy too. And back into the oven for about 10 more minutes. Okay. All right, so we can add our tomatoes in here. The longer, of course, the tomatoes sit, the more, sort of marinated they become, and they'll pick up on that flavor too. All right, so you just want it to be nice and coated. And this makes like just enough dressing that when you pour it, when you put the tomatoes over the eggplant, you have just enough liquid kind of left there to also coat the eggplant. So you get some extra flavor there. And our other toppings include arugula. So I love to add just fresh arugula on top of something like this. You'll see it a lot like chicken Milanese or something like that, where there's, it's like a fried cutlet and then there's a fresh salad on top, and a lot of times there will be arugula there. And arugula is also in season now. We're using a lot of fresh ingredients for summer in this dish. So the extra dressing from the tomato salad will also help to kind of dress that arugula also. Okay, so you definitely want some extra liquid in there. And our other topping is fresh mozzarella cheese. So the fresh mozzarella cheese, you can leave it out if you don't want to use any cheese. You can also just use shredded mozzarella cheese. You can buy the already, the little mini fresh mozzarella cheese balls, and you can just use those. I like to just buy a fresh mozzarella ball, and I just dice it up. So I'll use about half of this guy. Show you what I'm doing here. So all I'm doing is dicing this up. And even, you know, with dishes like this, like even if I was making eggplant parm or chicken parm, I love to use fresh mozzarella cheese instead of just buying shredded mozzarella cheese because you get so much more flavor. So I'll buy fresh mozzarella cheese and shred that even. But for something like this, we're just gonna have these cubes of mozzarella cheese. I think it's nice to have it fresh with something like this. Okay, so that's it. Just these nice cubes. Could also use different kinds of cheese that you like. What else would be good? Goat cheese or feta cheese would be really yummy sprinkled over this. That would all go well with the flavors that we have. The way I like to do this with the basil, we want just like a tablespoon or two of basil. So just pull it off the stem, get the leaves, and then what we're going to do is chiffonade the basil. This is bad etiquette that I have so much stuff on my cutting board right now, but I'm not being graded. Okay, so we're going to chiffonade the basil leaves. So what we want to do is get them all together, laying, oh, you can't even see that, laying straight, right, all laying in the same direction, and kind of roll them into a tight kind of log, and then just chop straight across. And you don't have to do it this way, it just makes it look pretty. Okay, so that's how then we get these kind of like ribbons. And we get more of like these basil ribbons instead of just chopped up basil. So that's a fun fancy trick. Okay, all right, so everything is ready to go. We just need oh, and there's the eggplant right on cue. Okay, eggplant done. Yes. Okay, so we get our eggplant nice and, well, these are the butt pieces. There we go. Nice and golden and crispy. So that's what we want. We want them this nice golden color. Don't want them to be getting burnt. Okay. And then we are ready to serve. So we're going to take a plate. I'll show you how I plate this guy up. So I'm going to put 3 pieces of eggplant. And I'll just show you because I don't know if you could really see like how they really are pretty thin. But you can definitely do it thinner if, you know, to your preference. Okay. So I stack 3 pieces of eggplant on the plate. And then I don't want the eggplant to get super soggy, so I actually put the arugula on first, just a nice handful of arugula. Then the mozzarella cheese. Okay, just kind of lay it all over there. And then, oh, we are going to toss our basil into the tomatoes. All right, so now they're ready to go in there. Toss that up. Okay. And then, so now this way, any extra liquid that's coming from the tomatoes will kind of drape over the arugula as a dressing rather than seeping into the eggplant, which will make the eggplant soggy. So that's why I like to do it this way. And then we're just spooning our tomatoes with a little of the extra liquid right over the top. And that is it, my friends. Voila.